Can I introduce the President of the FCC, Michelle Kennedy, to kick off proceedings? Michelle.
Hey, everybody. How's it going? I'm very formal. How's it going? Good to see everyone. I've been sitting here this whole time eating my dinner, so that's why my camera's been off. But yeah, just want to welcome everyone. We don't have as many on here as we did a few weeks ago, but hopefully we'll be able to catch up with the people who weren't able to make it. And I'm sure we'll be able to run something similar to this again for those people who weren't able to be here. The FCC have taken a really good initiative with judging this year, and these sorts of talks are definitely going to help our judges with these sort of topics like nature and things like that, where it is a little bit more difficult and where we struggle to get judges to actually judge these topics. So I really do want to say thank you to Roy for coming on here tonight and giving a specialized talk on this topic. So I am going to hand back to Don. Don has been doing a lot of the work when it comes to our judges course, the content and putting together these talks for all our judges. So I might be the president of the FCC, but he's definitely been doing all the work. I'm just going to let this next person in. All the work when it comes to this. So I'm going to hand back over to him to really run this talk tonight. So thank you, Don.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. Tonight's the first of what will be a number of professional development presentations for our FCC judges. The aim here is that we want to support all our judges with the most up-to-date knowledge about the best way to evaluate photographs. And it's something that when I've been going around to clubs and when other members of the FCC committee have been talking with clubs, a number of judges have said that they really would like not just to do a one-off training course with the FCC, but to have regular updates on best practice. There will be another presentation, so I'll send out the details, but our next presentation will be on the 12th of October. On the 12th, Timothy Moon will be talking about the best ways to judge architecture photographs. And as an architect himself, as well as a well-known photographer, I think everyone will find that very useful indeed. Tonight, however, I'm delighted to welcome Roy here to talk on how to judge nature photographs. Roy is a nature photographer who is a life member of the Lake Macquarie Camera Club, which was formerly known as Belmont 16s. Since 2008, when he started entering into international competitions, Roy has won numerous photographic awards and distinctions from international competitions around the world from different continents. He was also awarded the Nature Medallion by the Australian Photographic Society in 2015 for his contribution to nature photography. And Roy is also the Australian Membership Director, for the Photographic Society of America, and he was awarded the APSA honour in 2019. Roy also, as well as being an incredibly good nature photographer, has extensive experience as a judge, and that's of direct relevance to us tonight. Roy regularly directs or judges competitions at club, national and international levels. And as I mentioned earlier, he's also working with the FCC to hold our next judges course in Newcastle on the 30th of September and 1st of October. So if people could put their devices on mute unless they've got a question, it gives me great pleasure to invite Roy to talk to us tonight on how to judge nature photographs. Roy.
Thanks, Don, and thanks to everybody for coming along. Once I start the presentation, I will be moving through it fairly quickly because there's a lot of things to cover, but I will stop at regular intervals for you to ask questions, so you don't have to try to remember your question right until the end. So I'll dive straight into it. Don, can you just confirm that you can see the screen, my screen?
Yeah, all clear. Thanks, Roy.
Okay, great. Here we go. Okay. The way I'm going to address it tonight is to try to help you to overcome some of the challenges of judging nature images. I'm on the Zoom session. Sorry about that. Okay. Obviously, the first challenge that you face as a judge is understanding the nature definition. And I'll be addressing quite a few issues related to that interpretation of the definition as we go through. Sorry. Then, of course, once you've got an understanding of what the nature definition is, then your next challenge is deciding whether or not the images that you're judging actually meet the definition or if they violate the definition. And I'm sure you're already at least roughly familiar with the nature definition and know that it puts a strong emphasis on the storytelling aspect of nature images. And I'm going to be talking a fair bit tonight about how you assess the story in nature images. Of course, there's also the technical aspects of assessing the image and that and weighing that up against the storytelling and the composition and so on. And then in some cases, you need to arrive at a score for the image. Won't be spending a lot of time on that tonight. And of course, there's then the issue of giving feedback to the entrants, whether you're giving written feedback or a face-to-face feedback. So they're obviously the challenges that you face, and hopefully help you to overcome most of those challenges by the end of the presentation. So you're probably aware that way back in 2015 now, FIAP and PSA finally agreed on a common nature definition. Prior to that, the two major international organisations used different definitions for nature. And the Australian Photographic Society and the FCC have for many years followed the line of accepting the FIAP nature definition. So from 2015, that was fine. Everyone was on the same page. Then, of course, it's not a constant thing. The definition has not remained the same since 2015. And in particular, there were some significant changes to the definition in 2022, all 4 exhibitions from 1st of January 2022. Now, the main changes that occurred at that point were a simplification of the terminology, because the 2015 definition had some rather highfalutin, convoluted language in it that some people didn't understand. So the language was simplified, and in the definition, a greater emphasis was put on the idea that nature images should be truthful. It was always there, but somewhat in the background, but that was emphasized in the definition. And that 2022 version of the definition actually made some specific reference to unethical practices in nature photography. And it introduced 3 new things. Stitching of images, which was previously not allowed, then became okay. Whoops. And sorry. And then, of course, in 2023, there were some further changes to the definition. But this time, there was no change to the meaning of the definition, but all that happened was the formatting of it changed. So the layout of the definition was changed so that it was essentially divided into 2 parts. Part of the definition referring to the content that was permitted in nature images, and all of the things to do with editing were put together in the second part of the definition. And the further minor change was that as far as PSA is concerned, there's now the same language used in nature, photojournalism and photo travel definitions in relation to what is allowed and what is not allowed in images. So, and I should give you warning that the definition is likely to change again in the future, probably not for next year, but I've heard that there are some changes afoot for 2025. So it's important to keep up to date with the current version of the definition. So basically, the nature definition sets the limits on three things: what you can have by way of subject matter, the circumstances under which the images can be captured, and it's not just the distinction between nature and wildlife, but that's an important part of the circumstances. And of course, the third thing is the modifications that are allowed when the images are being edited. And when you're trying to help club members understand the nature definition, it can be very useful to use this as a starting point, because the definition is quite lengthy. It takes up about an A4 page. And so if you say, well, actually, it's just about three things: what you can photograph, when and how you can photograph those things, and what you can do with the images after you've captured them. And that's not a bad starting point for thinking about it. And that's the way I'm going to address it tonight. So starting with the subject matter, the definition has this wording in it. It's always been there, the idea that nature photography is a very broad thing. And the terminology of all branches of natural history has always been in the definition. And the part that I've got there in white type is the wording from the current version of the definition, that's basically saying, emphasizing the fact that it's a broad area, but the subject matter should not be something that's been either made or modified by humans. And the definition then goes on to specify some specific things that you cannot have or that are not allowed in nature images. And you're probably familiar with most of these. Obviously, people are not considered to be in nature. And cultivated plants and hybrid plants and domesticated animals, feral animals, human-created hybrid animals, mounted and preserved specimens, they're always been in the definitions. Those things, they weren't always stated in exactly those words, but they've always been basically prohibited or not allowed topics. And then, of course, there's the things created by humans. And I've put that in brackets because there are exceptions to that. And I'll talk about some of those exceptions. Now, when judges or entrants are trying to understand the definition and trying to make sense of these things that are not allowed, some of the common areas for confusion that you'll come across as judges and when talking to club members, and one of those areas is cultivated plants. What do we mean by a cultivated plant? Well, the obvious one are things that grow in your garden, but that's not the only thing that's classified as a cultivated plant. All cereal crops, for example, canola, wheat, barley, all of those things, those cereal crops are considered to be cultivated plants because they're plants which generally over long periods of time have been modified by humans so that they, regardless of the ancestors of those plants, they've been genetically modified over time. Now, one of the tricky parts of this is when you get an image like this, where you've got the lorikeet, which is obviously an allowed subject, no problem with having photographs of lorikeets. But in this case, it's on a plant which is growing in a garden, and it's actually a hybrid plant. And this particular image was taken in New South Wales, and the plant that it's growing on, it originated in Western Australia and so on. So when you have images like this, it's a bit of a grey area, and there are several grey areas associated with the definition. But the approach that I think is appropriate for judges to take is to look at an image like this and say, essentially, what is it? And in my mind, essentially, it's a photograph of a lorikeet, which is feeding on a plant, which just happens to be a hybrid or cultivated plant, as opposed to another image, which might be a photograph of the plant, which just happens to have a lorikeet sitting on it somewhere. And so there'll be occasions where you've got to be a bit a bit flexible and a bit generous with your interpretation. And in my mind, images like this are okay. Another area that causes a lot of confusion is around domesticated and feral animals. Now, we probably all recognize those things are domesticated animals. And it's important when you're thinking about domesticated animals to think of not the individual animal, but the species. And the confusion arises when people think about not just domesticated animals, but feral animals. Typical example we've got in Australia, we've got the brumbies in Kosciuszko. They are feral animals, not allowed in nature images. And the reason that they're considered to be feral is because their ancestors were domesticated. And in terms of the nature definition, that's exactly what feral means. It means that the animal was either domesticated and escaped into the wild, or its ancestors were domesticated and escaped into the wild. So images of horses, like the brumbies, are not permitted in nature. And one of the possible changes to the nature definition in future is that all horses will be not allowed in nature, because currently there's an exception for the Mongolian horses. But there's disputes scientifically about whether or not those Mongolian horses, the Przewalski horses, were in fact domesticated at one stage. Anyway, for the time being, certainly as far as the Australian images are concerned, the brumbies are feral. Likewise, the camels that roam around the outback are feral, and the pigs, and there's a whole range of things which are feral. There's a distinction, though, between feral animals and the word escapes me for the moment, the cane toads. Cane toads, you might say, oh, cane toads are feral. Technically, cane toads are not feral because they've never been domesticated, right? They've been imported to Australia, so they're not native to Australia, but that's not an issue. Whether or not the animal is native to the place where it was photographed is not the issue. Any questions at this stage? If you have a question, just unmute yourself and fire away.
Yes, please, Roy. It's Janice.
Yeah.
You just on that, relating to the cane toad not being native and certainly not being domesticated, and yet the previous photograph with the lorikeet, which is an Australian bird, with a tree from Western Australia, but in New South Wales, isn't that also an Australian tree?
Yeah, it's Australian tree. I was just making the point with that image that the critical thing to decide is it a photograph of a lorikeet that just happens to be on a plant which might be cultivated, growing in somebody's garden, versus a photograph of the whole tree that somewhere on it just happened to have a lorikeet.
And I understand, but if that was a tree that, excuse me, was not manipulated, but was perhaps originally grown in Western Australia, hadn't been genetically modified, but was growing in New South Wales, it would still qualify as a nature, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Even if the bird was or wasn't on it, it's in the same country. If the tree, even though it's from one part
that's okay. So long as that particular version of the flowering tree had not been genetically modified. In other words, it wasn't a hybrid.
Yes. Thank you. So any animal that's like the cane toad that's wild in Australia that hasn't been domesticated is okay if it's obviously taken in Australia.
Yep. Well,
okay, thank you.
Wherever it was taken, yeah.
I think if it's not domesticated, it's allowed. It doesn't have to be a native animal. That's what Roy was trying to say, I believe. So it's the same with the Indian miners. that aren't native to Australia, they are still nature because they're not domesticated. They're not native birds, but they're still classed as nature because they were not domesticated animals. We see them as feral because, and we call them flying cane toads. We see them as feral because they're a nuisance and they're not a native animal, but they're definitely, in the scheme of a nature competition, they are a nature. They would classify as nature.
Thank you. You clarified it for me. Thank you very much.
Unless I'm wrong, Roy.
Yeah, no, that's right. Exactly. Yeah.
Good evening, Roy. Dennis Jones.
Yep.
Dingoes.
Yep. As far as the Photographic Society of America is concerned, dingoes are okay. The view that is taken essentially is that they weren't domesticated in the sense of being genetically modified by humans. Now, we could spend all night arguing the point about that, but for the moment, dingoes are okay.
Okay.
Okay, I'll continue. This is a quote from the current definition. And the wording here is a little bit different from what it was back in the 2015 version of the definition. But the key wording here is the part that's in bold at the bottom, that the human element needs to be a necessary part of the nature story. Now, obviously, people are going to argue, well, what makes something necessary to the nature story versus not being necessary? And the way I approach it is this. You look at the image and you say to yourself, ask yourself this question. I've got the image in front of me. There's some human element in it, and there's obviously a nature story in it. If I imagine that the human element was not there, would the nature story still be there? And if your answer is no, I take away the human element, the nature story also disappears, then by definition, that means the human element was a necessary part of that nature story. So the image would be okay. And that's the typical example. Obviously, the building is a human element, but if we take away the building, then the bird's nest and the birds are not going to be there. So the building is a necessary part of this nature story. And if we look at the other side of that coin, we say, oh, well, here's another example. And this, we're now into the area where people are going to argue about this, but I'm just going to give you my interpretation here. Why is the bird on the post? The bird is on the post because it's taking advantage of that location so that it can look for food. It's looking around at the mice or whatever creatures might be on the ground in that area. It's using that human element, the post, to its advantage. If the post wasn't there, the bird's not going to be there. So the story about the bird looking for its food is not going to exist. So that would be okay. Another example here, we've obviously got this human element here. And that's simply illustrating that the water hens have taken advantage of this bit of package strapping that was in the environment, and they've utilized that to help hold their nest together. So we could consider in that situation that this human element was okay because it's a necessary part of that story about how the bird constructed the nest. Now, looking at the other side of the coin, if you look at the image that's got the human element in it, and you say, well, I'll take the human element away, and what happens to the nature story? Well, the nature story is still there. Right, we have this other side of the coin that if the human element is not a necessary part of the story, it's not allowed. So in an image like this, for example, the human elements here in the background, the drums and timber and so on, got absolutely nothing to do with the story about the Sika deer bounding through the snow. So is the nature story still there if we take those things away, yeah, well, it would be, but that means they are not necessary for the story, and therefore that image would not be allowed. And an area where entrants often get into trouble is in landscape images. Now, landscape images are quite okay. They're allowed in nature, no problem with that. And we could look at an image like this and say, yep, okay, it's a nature image, there's a story there, everything's fine, except in the background, we've got a vehicle and a person. The vehicle and the person are certainly not necessary for whatever nature story is going on here. So those two things, even though they're very, very small, are enough for the image to be disqualified as a nature image, because those things are not necessary for the nature story. There are 3 specific exceptions in relation to human elements in images. One of them are the scientific bands on birds. That's okay. Doesn't matter how obvious they are in the image, like here, that's allowed. It's still okay as a nature image. Even if you've got quite large scientific tagging on birds like this, or sometimes you'll see large tags like that on wild animals, and that's okay. And the third exception are the radio collars. Radio collars on wild animals are specifically allowed, so no problem with that. So any question at this point?
Yeah, it's Peter Sherlock, Roy.
Yes, Peter.
There could be now. Well, what's the ruling on animals in a zoo then? If a building is allowed to be part of the story because it's holding up a nest, is an animal's cage part of the story because it's confining the animal?
Images taken in zoos are allowed, provided you can't tell they're in a zoo.
Catch 22.
There's an important difference. There's an important difference here. With the birds nesting on the side of the building,
it's the bird's choice.
It's certainly the bird's choice to be there,
yeah.
And it's quite obvious that the building of the nest in that location is part of the nature story.
Yep.
Whereas the animal in captivity in the zoo, there's a story, but it's not really a nature story. It's a story about what humans have done to animals, and that's the distinction. So the definition currently and has for years specifically allowed images of captive animals, such as in zoos, but the human element, the cage, for example, should not be visible in the image.
I'm being the devil's advocate.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, and this is the sort of question that you're going to get in a club situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and just on that point, very briefly, captive animals are not allowed in wildlife sections of competitions.
Okay. Roy, can
Yep.
an animal in the zoo where there is in the background some evidence of the enclosure,
Yep,
be it man-made wall or something like that, is that then make it precluded as it's not dominant, it's part of background? Or excuse me.
yeah.
Sorry.
If you can tell in any way that the animal is in captivity, the image should not be allowed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the circumstances of capture, and that's essentially what we've been talking about now. So for the nature part of the definition, yes, the animal can be under some sort of control, such as in captivity. But if it's a specifically wildlife section, or there are awards for wildlife in the competition, then the animal or the subject, doesn't have to be an animal, could be an insect, must be living free and in a natural environment, and must be there of its own choosing. Those two things. And associated with that, the circumstances of capture, there's this statement in the definition. Now, the text that's in white here was added in 2022. The first part of it has always been there in the definition, not stated exactly that way, but the idea that a well-informed person, namely you, the judge, should be able to identify what it is you're looking at when you look at the nature image. But in the 2022 version of the definition, those extra words were added. The judge needs to be satisfied that no unethical practices were used to obtain that image. I'll give you some examples of this. As far as identifying the subject is concerned, you as the judge are not expected to be an expert on everything to do with nature. It's an impossibility. So, for example, if you see an image like this, fair enough, you as the judge can identify that as a spider. That's sufficient. You can being able to identify the subject, okay, it's a spider, that's enough. But if you see an image like that, you cannot be expected to know what it is. You can tell that it's a very close-up image of the eye of something, but what? Is it a bird? Is it a lizard? Is it whatever? And so an image like this would not satisfy the definition in the sense that the judges should be able to identify what it is. So if you're in a club situation and you're seeing images like that, then the best thing to do is to give advice to the people who own the image and say, look, you know, that doesn't really fit the definition because judges can't be expected to identify what it is. Now, in terms of the second part of that statement about no unethical practices being used, I hope you never come across any of these images, but certainly if you get to the stage where you're judging competitions, certainly at a national level or most definitely at an international level, you need to be aware of the fact that some people who call themselves nature photographers are very unethical. And I'll give you some quick examples. And I'm stressing that these are not my images, right? Now, an image like that, the first time you see an image like that, you might say, wow, that photographer was lucky. Just happened to get the raptor grabbing hold of the snake. Yeah, it really helps when the snake is nailed to the ground. And that's how these images are captured. The snakes are fixed to the ground, so they can't get away. And I've had people who submit images like this to international competitions admit to me that that's how they get those images. Or you might look at this image and say, wow, great. Raptors grab the rabbit and off we go. Look closely. The rabbit's got its feet tied together. Now, not many rabbits wander around nature with their feet tied together. So again, unethical practice. Now, this type of image is somewhat controversial because lots of people, even people I know, keep snakes as pets and they feed them live mice. I don't care what they do with their pets, but don't take a photograph of it and pretend it's a nature photograph. That is not a nature photograph, right? You can tell by the mouse that it's not a wild mouse, right? This is obviously taking place in captivity. It's set up for photography, and it's not the sort of image that we want to see in nature competitions. And a final example, this image at the top, you might say, oh, gee, that person was lucky. They got this lizard and it's just about to capture the grasshopper. That's great. Yeah, right. It's set up in the studio. All right. This is unethical practice. If somebody is putting images like this in a competition and pretending they're nature images, yeah, in my mind, they're being unethical, and certainly in the mind of the Photographic Society of America, this sort of image just doesn't cut it, and they get disqualified. So now moving on to the tricky bit of the modification of images, what you can do to the images when they're being edited, or what the entrance can do. And the key point is this, that the nature images must be truthful. They've got to convey the truth of what was captured. So obviously, these days, everybody does things to enhance their nature images. And there's a difference between enhancing an image by doing something like adjusting the exposure or contrast or whatever. That's different to actually changing the image. So it's no longer something that you actually captured. So the definition is very specific about these things. The definition starts by identifying the things that you are allowed to do when you're editing images. And it's always been the case that you could do things like cropping and straightening and correcting the perspective, perspective distortion caused by the lens and so on. So that's all okay, no problem. Then adjusting things like brightness and contrast and so on. The wording is somewhat open to interpretation, but it's the basic idea of restoring the appearance of what was there originally. And it's okay to sharpen, use noise reduction, okay to convert to grayscale monochrome. Now, things that are new from 2022, specifically now exposure blending is allowed, and I'll give an example of that in a moment. And likewise, focus stacking is now allowed specifically, and stitching of images. These are three new things which, if you're trying to explain to people why those three things are allowed, the basic answer is that each of these, in a sense, compensates for the limitation of camera equipment. Exposure blending compensates for the limited dynamic range that can be captured with a digital image. Focus stacking compensates for the limited depth of field you can get with a particular lens and so on. And stitching is essentially just allowing for the limitation of the field of view of the lens that you're using. So specific examples. Here we've got 4 images of the same subject, but they're different because they're taken with different exposure settings on the camera. But you can see they are all exactly the same thing, and they must have been taken in very quick succession. The spider hasn't moved. So those 4 images can be combined to produce a single exposure, which has got a wider dynamic range than any one of the individual images, and that's okay, no problem with that. For focus stacking, I emphasize the plant is not allowed, right? This is just to illustrate the concept of focus stacking. So that's a single image taken at f4 with a focus on this point. If I then take another image where I'm focusing back here, then another image when I'm focusing back here, and so on. So I take a whole series of images and combine them in programs like Photoshop, Helicon, whatever, to produce a single image with a larger depth of field. That's okay. And you'll find that these days, quite a lot of club members are doing focus stacking, particularly with macro shots, because it's quite easy to do the focus stacking these days, and there's lots of digital cameras that will do focus stacking in camera for you. So focus stacking is allowed. Now, for stitching of images, the limitation is that the images that are being stitched have to have overlapping content. So in these 2 images, there's obviously overlapping content because this wildebeest appears here and the same wildebeest appears there, right? So it's the same herd of wildebeest, just taken with a slight change of camera angle. So for an image like that, if they're stitched together to produce that image, where our star of the show here is now here, that's okay. That type of stitching is allowed because, as I said, it's essentially just taking, or compensating, if you like, for the fact that the individual images were taken with a lens that had a narrow field of view. However, if I take 3 images like this, same bird, but the bird is flying by, and I combine those 3 images into a single image like that, you could say, okay, the images have been stitched together, but that is not allowed because this final image is not reality. It's not the truth. I did not photograph 3 birds flying by. So the type of stitching that produces something that didn't exist are not allowed. Whereas the previous version, there was no change in reality. Any questions at this point?
Just going back to the one where you had the animals eating other animals and so forth. I had a lot of photographs of water dragons, eastern monitors, eating frogs that were also abundant in my garden.
Mm.
They were, I wasn't feeding them the frogs. The frogs were tadpoles and then frogs. So that isn't force fed, but I couldn't prove it. So
the situation you're describing is fine because it's something that was occurring naturally. You weren't feeding the frogs or the tadpoles to the water dragon. Now, but what you've raised is an important point. As a judge, you cannot always, in fact, very often, you can't tell the circumstances under which an image was captured. The example I showed of the lizard that was about to grab hold of the grasshopper, for example, where it was set up in a studio situation. Looking at just the original image, you might say, well, that looks okay. It looks like something that could have occurred in nature. But I showed you that particular image because it actually was entered in an international competition. It's not my image. It was entered in an international competition. Judges suspected that it was set up. And so the owner of the image was asked to supply the original raw file, and the original raw file showed that, yep, it was a set-up situation, and it wasn't acceptable. So in a lot of circumstances, you won't have the facility or the opportunity to ask for any sort of proof that an image is genuine. However, I personally take the approach, say I'm judging at a club in a stand-up situation. If I look at a nature image and I strongly suspect that it's violating the definition because of the way it was captured, I will say that. I will say, I can't be sure of the circumstances under which this image was captured, but it gives the impression that it may have been captured in inappropriate circumstances. Give the person the benefit of the doubt at that point, but make them aware of the possibility that it wasn't captured appropriately.
Thank you. That's very clear. Thank you.
Okay, moving on. Now, we talked about some of the editing techniques that you can do that are allowed, but then there are others that are specifically not allowed. And basically it comes down to things that change the truth of the image. So removing, adding, moving things around, using the clone tool, all those sorts of things are not allowed. And recently, adding a vignette was specifically added to the definition as something that's not allowed. Likewise, something relatively new was the specific prohibition of blurring parts of the image in order to hide things. I'll give you examples of these in a moment. Or darkening parts of the image to hide things. And conversion to monochrome images that are not grayscale. So in terms of removing pictorial elements, if I've got an image like this, I think, well, yeah, okay, that's fine, I like it, but I'm not too happy about the background here. If I remove this information for the background, this is no longer a nature image. Okay, that's a quite clear-cut one. I mean, it used to be you'd get rid of that with cloning. These days you can do it, in Photoshop with the remove tool and so on. And what you have to do here, and I think it's worth reminding club members of this when you're judging, that you as the judge have to rely on the entrants being honest and emphasize to them the need to be honest. Because it's very easy for people to, oh, well, it didn't really make much change. The bird's still there. But yep. And even in this situation, when I captured this image, well, not when I captured it, but when I viewed it on the computer, I thought, how inconvenient. We've got this bit of grass coming right across the lion's eye. Really easy to get rid of. But this is no longer a nature image. Now, a judge looking at this image is never going to know that originally there was a blade of, there's a bit of grass across here. But I know. I own the image. I altered the image. I know what's been done to it. And therefore, I know it can't be used as a nature image. And it's the sort of thing to emphasize to club members. Now, obviously, we want to have high technical standards in nature images, just as in all images, but we want high technical standards, but we still want the image to look natural. And now, as I said, there are a couple of things specifically prohibited in terms of changing the if you like, the pictorial qualities of the image. So adding vignettes and blurring backgrounds are not allowed. So, for example, if I've got that image and I add a vignette, I've really made it heavy here to emphasize the point, but the bottom image is no longer a nature image. The reason is very simple. This is not a natural scene. There was no darkening of the water around these birds. So that's an untruthful image and not allowed. Now, in terms of blurring the background, in this image, obviously we have the background's not in focus. There's some blurring of the background. And in images like this, you've got to use your judgment. As a judge, you have to make a call on this. You've got to say, okay, does that image look as though that's an as captured image? And yes, it is, because of the lens I was using and the aperture and the distance between me and the subject and so on. This is a naturally out of focus background. But if you see an image like this, that's when you start to get suspicious, because the background here no longer looks natural. It's blurring of the background that was done in processing. So if you were presented with an image like that in a club competition, it would be fair enough to make the comment that the background looks as though it may have been blurred in processing. I'm not accusing you of breaking the rules, but just make sure that the people are aware of what the rules are. Similar sort of situation with darkening of the background. An image like this, it's quite okay to crop it, no problem. Cropping is allowed, and we've still got a natural looking image. But if that image was processed so that it looked like that, it immediately doesn't look natural anymore. And the reason that and because it doesn't look natural, this darkening of the background is not allowed. However, you need to be aware that there are some circumstances where images with very close to or totally black backgrounds like this are exactly as the image was captured. Because this image was taken at night, it's pitch black, it's taken using a flash, and that's just what the background looks like. So again, you don't be too quick in pouncing on people and saying, black background, not allowed. It's whether or not the image looks natural. That's the critical thing. Something that is often very, very difficult to detect, but is not allowed and needs to be emphasized to people. You can't add things to your image. So if this is my original image and I thought, well, look a whole lot better with a couple of extra elephants, I'll wax some more in. Yeah, okay, it looks better. more interesting image, that's not allowed because these extra elephants were put into the scene. So that's not allowed. And a simple version of that is where people tend to duplicate things in images. So if I've got that image, think, well, okay, that's fine. 1 vulture's good. 3 have got to be better. So I'll duplicate the image, change the angle on a bit. It might be a more pictorially appealing image, but it's not a nature image because it doesn't tell the truth. And the simplest one you like to come across these days, there's one before it. You can't move things around in the image. I can't look at that image and say, well, it would have been really convenient if the birds were facing one another. Yeah, okay, but it's no longer a nature image. And this is the sort of situation where if you were just presented with the image on the right, you're probably not going to know that actually what was captured was the image on the left. And so sometimes the people who are breaking the rules get away with it for that reason. Now, in terms of replacing things, the one you're going to come across all the time, no, well, not all the time, very frequently these days, is sky replacement. So if I got that image, I think, gee, that's pretty crap. The sky looks rubbish. It'll look a whole lot better if we had a nice sky. Yeah, okay, but it's not a nature image. And because sky replacement is so easy these days in virtually any software that people are using, you always need to be, have your suspicion radar out, if you like, that might be happening. Now, another thing that, again, is easy these days because of the progression in software is blending of images. And you can't do that. So if I've got that image, I'm thinking, oh, okay, I like that. Oh, nice sunset. Yeah, okay. What about if we combine them? Okay, but it's not a nature image because they've been blended. It's not truthful. The bird wasn't flying in front of the sunset. And of course, you can't put clip art in your image, or not just clip art, but any images that you didn't capture at all, images that belong to somebody else. Now, that's a genuine image. It's the only time I've ever seen a koala relaxing like that, but that's a genuine image, no problem. But when I saw that image, I thought, well, why would the koala be relaxing like that? Well, it's pretty obvious. But you can't do that, right? It's not a nature image, and that's an obvious one. Anyway, monochrome conversions. Monochrome conversions are allowed providing it's just a grayscale conversion. And you can't have toned images, toned monochrome images in nature, and you can't have infrared images, either images that were captured using a camera capable of infrared captures, or conversions in programs like Photoshop that give you an image that simulates infrared capture. And likewise, you can't have partially desaturated images. So an image like this is fine because it's a grayscale image. If it was a toned image like that, that's not allowed. And an image like that, which is infrared, is not allowed. Unfortunate, but it's not allowed. And if we start with an image like that and partially desaturate it, that's not allowed. And the reason is quite simple, not natural. And if we go to that extreme where we're making part of the image grayscale, but the rest of it color, that's obviously not allowed. Any questions? No? Okay, good. Okay, now we come on to the part that as a judge has often got you scratching your head. The idea of the nature story. Because this is a quote from the definition of saying the nature story is the most important part. So images like this, you can say, okay, yes, there's a nature story there, but the story in these two images is essentially limited to a description. It's saying, here's the rainbow lorikeet, this is what it looks like. And what we need for strong nature stories is more than just pretty pictures. So, and this is a point that something you'll come across quite a lot when you're judging nature images. You'll see portraits or close-ups of birds, sometimes animals, and you might look at it and say, wow, pictorially, it's a great image, but where's the story? What's the story? Now, I use this little framework for evaluating stories in nature images. Thinking, first of all, about images of living creatures, birds, mammals, insects, whatever. So the simplest story is the descriptive story, like the image you just saw of the lorikeet. Here it is. This is what it looks like. This is what shape it is. This is what color it is, and so on. To go to the next step, we can think, well, here's an image and it's showing us something about either the behavior of the creature or something about its life cycle. You know, this is how it gets its food, or even this is just what it eats, or this is how it reproduces, and so on. Then at the next level, you can have images that are demonstrating interaction between creatures of the same species. So it might be the parent and offspring, for example, would be a typical one. And that's going beyond, it certainly tells you something about life cycle and behavior, but it's going a little bit beyond that, because there's a couple of creatures involved and they're definitely interacting with one another. And then you have images where you've got two or more creatures interacting, but they're not interacting with the same species, they're interacting with different species. And I'll show you some examples of these in a moment. So we've got basically those four levels. And in each case, if the image you're looking at is giving you information about the habitat or the situation where these things are happening, that's adding to the nature story. That's giving you more information. And so essentially it's just, I'll emphasize, it's one way of distinguishing between what you might call a weak nature story and a strong nature story. So for example, an image like this, you can say, well, it's got good pictorial qualities. It's clear, the detail is there, the lighting is beautiful, it's showing us the natural colors of the jackal and so on. So pictorially, it's fine. What's the nature story? Well, the nature story here is essentially a descriptive one. This is what a black-backed jackal looks like. You can see a little bit of the environment, but not enough of the environment to really give you any indication of where it is or why it's in that location. So it's a very limited nature story in an image like that. Same sort of thing here with the photograph of the Australian native flower. Here it is. This is what it looks like. End of story. We've got no indication of where it's growing, you know, what's in the surroundings and so on. Likewise here. Here we've got the impala buck. This is what it looks like. Well, this is what its head looks like. We don't, you know, the image is not even telling us what the rest of the body is like. So whilst you might be happy with the composition and the lighting, etc., the nature story is very limited compared to this image where we've got a similar animal, but because we've got the couple of little oxpeckers on here, the story is no longer just the descriptive story of the impala buck. We've got a couple of things going on here. We've got the fact that it's doing something, it's about to get a drink, but the important part of the nature story is up here. The story is about the symbiotic relationship between the impala and the oxpecker. Here, a couple of springboks. Yeah, okay, but they're basically just springboks standing there being springboks. Nothing exciting about that. Here, what have we got? We've got an image that's telling us something more than the description of this is what a springbok looks like. This image is illustrating this typical strange behavior of springboks called plonking, where they jump up in the air for no apparent reason. So there's more to it than just a descriptive bit of information. All nature photographers like photographing birds in flight. Great, okay. So here we've got the descriptive information, which is fine. And we've got a bit of information about what its body positions are when it's flying. So we've got that bit of information. But compare that to an image like this, we've got the same sort of information we had in the previous image, the descriptive information, the flight information, but because it's carrying the sticks, we can imply that it's carrying nest material, and so it's adding that extra little bit to the story. Here we've got a couple of juvenile goshawks, and basically they're just sitting there being juvenile goshawks. Again, descriptive information. No interaction between them at all, and therefore we've got quite a limited story. We can imagine why they might be there, but there's nothing in the image to tell us why they're there. Compared to this image, where we've got a bit more of a story, we're starting to get the story that, okay, we've got this one is here and this one is coming in, perhaps trying to land in the same location. So got a little bit extra story. And here we've got more story again. Here we have very specific interaction between the two of them. We can see that they're having a bit of a barney with one another. So we've got a stronger image than them just sitting there on a stick. Okay, here, and this is a type of image that you'll see quite frequently in nature, basically the portrait. And again, story is limited essentially to description. This is what the bird looks like, or this is what the head of this particular bird looks like. Nothing more. Compared to an image like this, where we have a very specific, obvious nature story. It's not just a descriptive story of the bird, but it's telling us that it's captured some food. It's telling us what the food is. It's giving some indication of where it got the food, where it captured the food, and so on. So there's several levels to the story in this case. Here, again, we're back to the portrait situation. A few drops of water on his head. So, okay, the lion's probably in the rain, but again, very, very limited story. And no matter how much you might like the image as a pictorial image, it is quite a limited nature story. There's nothing special about it in terms of the story, compared to this image, where we've got a very strong and clear nature story, the story about the interaction between the cub and the lioness, and the lioness not being too happy with what's going on. So we've got a much stronger story there. A similar sort of situation here, where here we've got multiple levels to the nature story, because we've got the obvious thing, okay, we're a lioness and some cubs and they're having a feed, but there's the extra information of, okay, we can tell what the victim was here, the wildebeest, and we can see that although the cubs are quite young, they're just starting to eat meat and so on. So there's several levels to the story. At a much simpler level, images of spiders. I guess all photographers at some stage like photographing spiders. Here, essentially, okay, it's a spider. Spider sitting in a web being a spider. We've got the descriptive information, the particular markings on the spider and so on. So there's that information. It's a bit like the portrait of a bird. It's got the descriptive information. Similar here, although here we've got a little bit more information because the image has been taken side on to the spider. We can see the profile, and we've got the additional story that it's quite an unusual shape. We've still got information about the markings of it and so on, as we had up in this image, but it doesn't go much beyond this sort of image, but it does go a little bit further. And then, of course, we have this sort of image where it's not just a description of the spider, but it's showing that it's captured the prey and it's trying to wrap it up and so on. Or we might have this sort of image where this is telling quite a specific story about this spider, the net casting spider. It's telling the story of how it hangs by a thread and it weaves this little net, and it's sitting there waiting for the prey to come along so I can throw the net over it. Now, this is another type of image that you'll probably see quite often as a judge, close-up images of insects. And this type of image is becoming more and more popular as it becomes easier to do focus stacking, and in particular in-camera focus stacking. Now, whilst an image like this has got quite strong impact, you know, it's an in-your-face type image. Wow, okay, how did you get that? You know, did it finish out biting you? Those sort of thoughts might go through your head, but essentially it's just descriptive. It's saying this is essentially what the front end of a paper wasp looks like. There's not much additional nature story in that, compared to this image, which is the same wasp, but it's now showing, okay, not only do we have the descriptive information about the front end of the wasp, but we've also got the information about the nest that it's built, and we can see in the nest that it's built the various stages of development of the things in each of the locations. Or again, same wasp, same nest, but taken several weeks later, so that the stages of development have changed, and we can now see that this pupa has covered itself in, and this one's in the process of covering itself in, and so on. So we've got a much stronger nature story here than we had in the image, which was just showing you the face of the wasp. Another example here of the symbiotic relationship that we saw with the impala. Now, an image like this, it's a passive image in that the lioness is just sitting there, but the story is in all the injuries that she's got. And that's a much stronger image than if it's just a photograph of a lion sitting there being a lion. You know, we can see all the injuries around the head, the injuries around this part of the body, and so on. So there's an obvious story there. We haven't got the preliminaries to the story. We don't know how the lioness came to be injured in this way, but there's the implication there that she was probably involved in some sort of pretty severe battle with something, because down here and up here, she seems to have little bits of bone sticking out of her, and so on. So it's a much stronger story. And here's an unusual one. There's a obvious story behind this image. Again, we don't know what it was that bit a chunk out of the side of the zebra. We can assume it was probably lion, hyena, whatever. We don't know, and interesting part of this, the zebra seems quite happy. It's just having a feed, not worried about the fact that he's got this great chunk taken out of it. So there's a different sort of story in that image. And then here's an unusual one. Just think for a moment, if you saw that image in a nature competition, what would you think? Would you think, hang on a minute, somebody's been playing around in Photoshop here? You know, what have they done to the back end of the zebra? Well, actually, nothing. This is a particular type of zebra called a quokka-like zebra. And the quagga-like rather. The quagga is an ancient ancestor of zebras, and it had this sort of marking all over its body. And some of the quagga genes are still in the zebra gene pool, and very, very occasionally you'll see a zebra that looks like that. So there's actually, even though this is just a descriptive story, it's still a strong descriptive story. Much more descriptive, much stronger, if you like, than say, just an image of an ordinary zebra standing there. And then, of course, sometimes you'll get nature images that have got multiple stories in the one image. You've got the story here in the foreground of the crocodiles fighting, and in the background, you've got the birds. They're obviously looking for food, and they're doing it right beside the crocodile. So there's multiple stories in that image. So we're going fairly high up the scale now in terms of the strength of nature images. And all of those that I've shown you so far have involved some sort of living creature: birds, animals, insects, reptiles, and so on. But as I mentioned before, in nature, landscapes are allowed. Now, if you're trying to assess this image in terms of its nature story, not just its pictorial quality, but its nature story, then it's not a very strong story. It's what we've got here. We've got very limited information about the background landscape. There's water. We can't really tell what situation it is. And we've got some dead little trees in the water. So very limited nature story. Compared with this sort of landscape image, where there's much more information in here to build up a nature story. We've got some information about the location, the cliff faces, and a bit of a river going through it, and the gum trees and the rocks and so on. So there's more information here. It's a different sort of situation to the nature images where you've got animals interacting and so on. But nevertheless, comparing landscape to landscape, it's easy to see that some landscapes have got much more information in them, or much more story in them than others. And again, an image like this, landscape image like this, there's lots of information and therefore nature story incorporated into this sort of landscape image. Back to our birds, we can tell here, we can imply the story here. We can say, okay, the stork is looking for food, it's about to capture a fish. Okay, fair enough, but obviously this sort of image has got a stronger story because we can see what it was that it caught. What about this image? What's the story here? If you've never seen one of these birds, there are a raptor in Africa called a secretary bird. You might wonder what the story is, and you can assume it's probably looking for food, and that would be a fair assumption because actually what it's looking for is the adder. But incorporating the snake in the image gives you a stronger story than just having the bird. Now, as I mentioned before, nature, wildlife, there's a distinction, and for wildlife, it's the additional requirement. All the other things apply, but there's this additional requirement that the creature must be living free, not restrained. And you certainly can't take things out of their natural environment in order to photograph them and then pretend that it's a wildlife photograph. And you can't control the subject in any way whatsoever. And at the moment, we've got this rather strange situation where botanical organisms are still considered in wildlife, and you can't take them out of their natural environment for photographic purposes. And you can't do any sort of staging of images for and call it wildlife. For example, you can't do any sort of baiting of animals in the wild, birds, raptors, and so on, and pretend that it's wildlife. In terms of giving advice to club members, if they're wondering, well, how can I convince the judges that my image is wildlife and not nature? Well, if it's an image like that, it's a bit hard to tell because we can't see anything of the environment where the lion is. Maybe it's in the wild, maybe it's in a zoo, whereas an image like that, it's the same lion, but we're now seeing more of the environment, and you can be reasonably confident that this image is actually a wildlife image. Obviously, if you're seeing images like this, there's no question that it's wildlife. That's okay. An image like that, you're going to be struggling. You're not going to know whether this snake, which is swallowing the frog, is in captivity or if it's in the wild. I can assure you it was in the wild, but that's one of the difficulties you're going to have judging wildlife is knowing or trying to work out what the circumstances were. And of course, sometimes, much to my frustration, you'll see images like this that pretend to be wildlife or even nature. There is no way in the wide world that that image is genuine, right? Yeah, I've put the name of the person who owns it down here to protect the guilty. Yeah, so if you see images like that in nature competitions, be very, very suspicious of them. Any questions?
Roy, can I say that has been very, very useful in helping people to work out what is meant by a story in nature, and that's been terrific. My question is, you covered animals a lot. You mentioned landscapes briefly as well. What about if people are putting in photographs of plants, fungi, and so on? What do we look for with stories in those sort of situations?
Okay, in those situations, you look for something that's, I'll put it this way, more than a portrait of the fungi, for example. So if you take a very close-up image of a fungi, so that that's all you're seeing, it's much like the descriptive image of a bird portrait. So the best idea, if you're photographing fungi, is to at least show some of the environment in which it's growing. And that's going to give you some more information about where it grows, not just what it looks like. And with botanical things like flowers, for example, quite often, if you've got an image which shows a full bloom and a partially opened bloom and maybe just a bud, you're telling something of the life cycle of the flower or of the plant, and that can be useful to add to the story. And again, if you can show something of the environment, that helps. So it's all about asking yourself, how much information is in this image, and what sort of information is it? Is it just descriptive information, or is it more than that? Okay, I'll move on. One of the things that you try to take into account when you're judging images is the impact of them. So what do we mean by the impact of an image? Well, I like to think of impact as being made up of four things. There's the storytelling aspect of it. If you look at an image and there's an immediately strong story in it, that's part of the impact. The composition of the image contributes to its impact. The technical aspects of the image contributes to its impact, and also the creativity. Because impact, I see impact, two aspects of impact. There's the initial impact. You see the image and you think, wow, that's got my attention. And then does it sustain your attention? If you look at the image, you get an initial impact, and then 5 seconds later, you're no longer interested in the image, not strong impact. But if you look at an image, you really want to study it, work out what's going on, and the memory of the image sticks with you, then it has impact in that way as well. So those four aspects of it are obviously overlapping. They can't be considered in isolation. They go together to give you the impact for your image. And the impact obviously also depends on the subject matter of your image. So basically, I think strong nature images have these characteristics. You should be able to look at the nature image and immediately recognize what the story is, or immediately recognize that there is a detailed story there that you need to think about. It should be well composed. Now, and the simple way of thinking of composition from my point of view is everything that needs to be in the image is there, and there's nothing in the image that doesn't need to be there. Obviously, you want good technical qualities, clarity and natural colors and so on. And it's good if the content is a little bit different. And I'll just expand on that, because I mentioned in terms of impact, creativity, and that ties in with the image being a little bit different. You don't want to be seeing the same thing over and over and over and over again. So I'm sure all of you have seen images like this, the so-called snow monkeys, the Japanese macaques that get in the hot water spring to keep themselves warm. If you ever get a chance to visit, fabulous. You'll get photographs like this by the dozen. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people every year get photographs just like that. And you'll see lots of these when you're judging. Not much creativity there. Same location, but instead of looking at the water, you look at the snow behind you, and you get this sort of image, which is different. you've got the juvenile macaques, and they're doing what juveniles do. They rumble around and fight with one another and so on. So you get something that's a little bit different. And that's what I meant by having a nature image where the judges might look, oh, wow, I haven't seen that before. And that's, I think, a good thing. Some common mistakes that you'll see in terms of editing when you're judging images: over sharpening can be a huge problem. You'll see it a lot, particularly these days where it's really easy to, you're using Photoshop and then you just go topaz sharpen or whatever and over sharpen it. And it's certainly worth commenting on that if you see it when you're judging. Oversaturation, you've got a photograph of a nice rainbow lorikeet, so the colors cranked up to make it look a bit unreal. Too much contrast can be a very common thing, particularly too much contrast, which comes about as a result of using controls like clarity controls. Inappropriate cropping is a very common problem, particularly just lopping off little bits of the creature when you should show all of it. Anything that makes the image look unnatural, any editing process that gives an unnatural appearance to the image is something you definitely need to be commenting on. And so my basic suggestion when you are commenting on nature images at a club level is make some comment about its initial impact and what it is that grabs your attention in the image. Make some comments about its technical and pictorial qualities as they relate to the composition of the image, and talk about the story that's in the image. What nature story do you see in the image, and how is the story you are seeing related to these other two factors, in particular the composition and the technical aspects of the image? Is it all coherent? And you make comments along those lines. So, if you're seeing an image like this, for example, you might be commenting on the fact that it's got a very obvious nature story, and the nature story is about the interaction between the lion and the cub, and what that implies in terms of the type of interactions going on, and so on. An image like this is a little bit different because whilst in this image, the story is immediate and obvious. It's about the interaction. Here, the first thing that gets your attention when you look at this image is the face of this young lion and its eyes. It's looking straight in the direction of the camera. Attention goes straight to that. Then what happens? Then you try to figure out, well, what else is going on? And that's when you see the three doves. And so that's when the story starts to build up. It becomes a story about this juvenile lion thinking it's really clever and can catch some birds to eat. So we've got the nature story, but it's, on the one hand, less obvious than the previous image, but it's, in another way, it's more complicated than the previous image. So you'd be commenting along those lines. Something like this, you would probably want to make a comment, something along the lines, well, there's immediate impact because it's in your face, really close up, the eyes are really prominent. And then you might go on to be saying something about it being a little bit unusual, in that certainly in the wild, it would be most unusual to be capturing that image, an image from the eye level of the lion when the lion is lying down on the ground. And so there's those compositional things that you might be commenting on. And by the way, it was taken in the wild, and no, I wasn't crawling on my belly. So some general advice that you could give to club members about nature images when you're judging nature, particularly if you're there in person in the club. It's important, I think, to always emphasize that they follow ethical practices. Even if you don't see anything that you suspect is unethical on the night, it's worth making a little bit brief mention about the ethical things. It's important to emphasize that the club members read, understand, and follow the current nature definition, because as I said, it does change over time and it will change further in the future. You should be encouraging them to emphasize the nature story in their images, so that when they go out to photograph nature, they're not just going out saying, oh, I'm going out today to photograph some birds. They're going out with something specific in mind. They're trying to capture nature stories. That should be their goal. You need to emphasize that whatever editing they do needs to comply with the rules, and the end result has to be natural. And just a final message to give to club members is this. If they are in any doubt about whether the subject matter of their image satisfies the nature definition, or the editing they do satisfies their nature definition, then put the image in an open competition. Put it in color or mono. Don't put it in nature. Don't push your luck. And we'll come to an end there, and some final questions. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Okay, Roy, that was a fantastic talk. Are there questions from people to Roy?
It was very, very good.
Thanks, Janice. Any other comments? Remember, you'll need to turn off your mute.
You said you are recording this. Is it possible to get a copy of it later on so we can sort of rehash it before we go out to do more judging on nature?
Yes, we do want to make this as a resource for all FCC judges. So I need to work with, find out from Michelle how we actually do it, but we will get it on the website, and I will let all judges on the FCC list know.
Yeah, it'd be most valuable next time I'm doing a nature judging. I could just go through it and just to refresh my ideas. Very good. I'm most impressed and helpful.
Thanks, Nick. Any other thoughts, questions?
Yeah, Dennis here. I'd make the observation that Roy made about if a picture's taken in a zoo, it really has got to exclude the facts that it's taken in a zoo. And I think in a lot of clubs that I visit, that reliance upon, oh, it's a zoo picture, it's okay, probably needs a bit more clarification, that people understand that the final delivered product doesn't show the elements of the zoo, even though it was there. So it's like, if you did it, you should never know it. And I don't think that's probably well understood by clubs, even though the definition's fairly clear on it.
That's good advice to all of us judges. Part of our role is to help club members learn about the definitions and learn how to improve their photography. So we do have a role to help people learn about these things so they can produce better photos. Any other questions of Roy?
Yeah, not necessarily a question, but what might be useful to judges is another session similar to this, but giving us a little or a few more hints on how to detect some of the illegal tactics that are taken, and like dropping another image into a photograph. I mean, today it's becoming very, very difficult to detect some of these things without going back to the original raw file. So from my point of view, I think you're in a judging situation, and if we sort of roll back to, say, judging Top Shot back at the end of May, there are a few images that roll through, and I'm looking at them and going, oh, it just doesn't look right. But it doesn't look wrong enough to put your hand up and say, let's ask for the raw file.
I'd be happy to do a follow-up talk on post-processing and identifying those things. They were things that we definitely touched on when we did the last judges course, was on post-processing and ways to help judges identify, particularly on what judges should be seeing, and how to identify those things that are often overlooked, particularly in club judging. And we touched on that in our judges course. So I'd be happy to do a talk on that if there's enough interest, if people are interested in wanting to actually go over that and sort of learning how to spot those sort of telltale signs that you might overlook otherwise?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
People
good call.
generally happy to do that. I can see your faces, so just wave or nod or.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people
I'd
waving.
be up for that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, as I say, our next
Yeah.
presentation is on how to judge architectural photography. So, Michelle, we might drop you in for the third presentation.
Happy to do that. Yep.
Look at
I'm
these-
sure there'll be plenty of people who, particularly with the newest stuff that's coming out, there's ways to be able to tell when something's been manipulated. Obviously it's not, you can't see everything, but there are some things to help you identify things like sky replacements and stuff like that. So, which will help with nature judging in particular. At least to help you identify when you should ask the question if something's been manipulated.
Just to add to that, the new FCC judges course that we've been running has this as a specific item in that judges course because it is such a big issue nowadays. Any other questions or comments?
No, I was just going to talk through that. I did the course quite some time ago, and I would love to be able to do a refresher covering these neuro aspects.
Yes, Bruce. That was Bruce, I think.
I think that was
Dennis.
that Dennis.
Dennis.
That was
Dennis, sorry. We're deliberate. The course that's being provided in Newcastle is for people in Newcastle, but we've also advertised it for any existing judges who want to do a refresher course as well. We'll continue to do that in future, so we'll definitely provide opportunities for all existing judges to pick up on the latest and developments in evaluating photos. That's definitely a priority for the FCC. Any other questions, comments?
Can I just say that Roy has actually sparked something in me that I really want to be a nature judge now.
Great.
I think that's where my direction will be.
It's good.
Good.
We don't have enough.
There's one thing that I forgot to mention that can be useful to you. If you go to the PSA, that's the Photographic Society of America, go to their website, and in the section of the website for the PSA Nature Division, you will find a document, about a 20-page document, which is called a Guide for Nature Photographers and Judges. And it goes through all the stuff I talked about tonight, plus other things, with examples, and it's aimed at both photographers and judges. So that document is worth having a look at. If you look at that document in the next couple of months, then you need to go and visit it again early next year because it's currently being revised. But it's certainly worth having a look at.
So some good resources to follow up. Any other comments or questions?
And if you do find out later that you've got some questions, either as a result of tonight or you have a look at the guide, which I wrote, and you've got some questions, then don't hesitate to send me an email.
I have one question relating to one of the images that was shown near the end of that presentation, in the landscape, nature landscape, and you had a bush scene and a creek and so forth. A lovely image, but I thought I detected a partial view of a red lifeguard
Preserver.
ring.
I saw it too, Janice.
So is that then?
And that would have
is that-
disqualified the image.
I thought so.
I saw it too, and I was going
I'm
to
laughing. I'm laughing
did you?
because you're quite right. There is a red life
preserve,
in that image, and I deliberately didn't mention it because I wanted to see how many of you picked up on it.
Yeah. Good job, Janice. Yeah, I spotted that one.
Yeah, and that's good
glad-
because you do need to particularly with landscape images, you do need to look carefully for things that shouldn't be there, because quite often in a landscape there'll be something in the background that that shouldn't be there. A building.
It was so small too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tiny.
What about it?
In terms of advice to club members in those situations, you have to simply say, unfortunately, it doesn't meet the definition. That does not mean you can clone out that thing. It's got to stay there. Otherwise, you're breaking that rule. Put it down to experience and put the image in a colour competition, not a nature competition.
So further again, Roy, an image, say, taken out off the coast, whale watching.
Yeah.
Lovely image of a whale fairly close in the very far distance on the horizon. It's obvious there's some small buildings. Nature or not nature?
No, not. The building has got nothing to do with the nature story of the whale breaching. It's a tough one, but with rules for any sort of competition, there has to be a situation where, as far as possible, the rules are black and white. Otherwise,
yeah,
you know, people are forever arguing, you know, well, it was only little, it didn't really take up much space. Yeah, and so that's and sometimes as a judge, you have to make that sort of comment to the club members. Look, it's a fantastic image, and otherwise it would be a, you know, honours or judge's choice or whatever, but there's this little thing that stops it being accepted.
Yeah.
I was scribing some years ago for one of the competitions. There were 3 judges, and there was another judge sitting here, and then they all there were 2 whale images, one taken in dusk and there were lights obviously on the horizon, other daytime earlier, and the buildings were just discernible. The one that the judge said was okay had the lights, and the one that didn't got knocked out. We couldn't understand it.
Yeah, they should not, neither should be.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's part of what Dom was saying, that you've got a dual role when you go to a club to judge, or if you're judging online for them. There's 2 aspects to your role. One is to evaluate the images. The other is to help to educate the club members. And if you pretend that something is okay when it's not, that's not helping the members, particularly if you're judging for a club where some of the members engage in competitions beyond the club level.
Last chance, ladies and gentlemen. Are there any more final questions or comments? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Could you all please put your hands together or wave for Roy's terrific presentation?
Yep. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Roy.
Have fun with your photography and your judging.
Thank you, Roy.
So just to summarise next steps from now, if you have any other ideas for presentations, please send an email to me at New South Wales FCC Secretary. We've already had a number of judges asking that they'd like a presentation on creative photography, for example. That's something they find quite difficult. So if you have any other suggestions, send them in. Secondly, this recording will be put on the website somehow, and once I've worked out with Michelle what we need to do, I'll let everyone know. And the third thing is we look forward to seeing you at future professional development courses, because I believe not only is this good for us as judges, it means we're in a much better position to help our club members to produce better and better photographs. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, and good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.